So good morning. My name is Mark Pearson. I'm a professor of architecture here at College of DuPage, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Visiting Artist Series lecture. It's great to see all of you here in the Playhouse Theater. The Visiting Artist Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the Departments of Art, Architecture, and Photography here at COD. It's fitting for our first in-person lecture in the past 2 years for me to introduce Vladimir Radutny. Vladimir was originally scheduled to be part of our Spring 2020 series, and I hope that you'll see today how the 2020 series theme of materiality fits so well with Vladimir's elegantly crafted and thoughtfully detailed work. I just met Vladimir in person this morning for the first time, but he and I share a common mentor, Professor Jeff Poss from the University of Illinois. And it was Professor Poss, probably about the time that Vladimir won the AIA Chicago Young Architects Award, who introduced me to Vladimir's work and instructed me that I should pay attention to his design studio. Vladimir Radutny was born in the Ukraine, and in 1989, his family arrived in Chicago as part of an immigration wave of Russian Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in architecture from the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. In 2008, he founded his Chicago-based architecture and design studio. He has held teaching appointments at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he continues to teach. Vladimir's multi-disciplinary architecture practice focuses on innovative design solutions that challenge the conventional interpretations of space, function, and material use. He believes in architecture as an art form with the capacity to not just alter space, but to change perceptions, feelings, and habits. So after the longest lecture lead time ever, we've been planning this lecture, I think, for almost 4 years now. I'm especially thrilled to have Vladimir here in person with us today. So please join me in welcoming Vladimir Radutny.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me here and to share my thoughts and work. Preparing this lecture and giving the talk today has been pretty hard for me. I'm from the part of the world that's currently being destroyed by a madman, and it's pretty hard knowing that your birthplace and the place you came from is being erased, especially being an architect and somebody who creates and wants to improve the spaces that we're focused on. But we need to stay optimistic, strong, and hope we can overcome and prevail this insanity. I grew up and I was born in a city called Nikolayev. A lot of you start watching the news, you start to understand the geography a little bit better of that region. But it's a small town. Comparatively, it's about 600,000 to 800,000 people near the Black Sea. It's near Odessa. But for me, the creativity and kind of the desire to be a creator or somebody who was interested in arts started there, specifically with my grandfather, who was also an artist. And I was around the kind of the creative atmosphere growing up. My mom also sent me to an art school where I learned how to draw and paint. So I had some foundation of understanding what the art world is about. And growing up, that was always part of my foundation. However, my realization that I wanted to make things and actually build things didn't start until I started studying architecture at University of Illinois. I attended that school for both my undergrad and graduate degrees. I traveled quite a bit abroad. I was exposed to architecture primarily in Europe, and I sort of fell in love with the profession after always wanted to do something creative. While I was at U of I did a couple studies abroad, and one particular was experiences with contemporary walls. And what you see on the screen here is interpretive models that I put together while traveling. I selected 5 buildings. One of them was the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I would build these really interesting kind of intricate models using materials that I've never tried in the past to kind of evoke a certain quality and a certain emotion that I was experiencing. Then I put an exhibit at school for people to see and share my work. And then I was also very fortunate while I was in school to have been in the right place, in the right time, where somebody from an Apostolic Life church came into the computer lab, and they were asking if any student would be able to help them design a baptistry and an altar. And one of the students pointed in my direction, saying that he could help you out, because I was sort of known as that guy that just liked to make things and, kind of was a creative person. Because the graduate program has multiple tracks. There's a design track, there's a practice track, a structures track. I was on the design track. So I met with these people, and I came up with an idea of something that was metaphorically relevant, where hands of man and hands of God sort of come together. And the altar is the focal point. But what was interesting to me at the time, I was really focused on kind of the visual perception of seeing things and how spaces and elements and materials can sort of change your viewing. And in this particular example, the walls are at different heights, and they're sort of converging to kind of force your visual perception of perspective, sort of forcing that perspective towards the center. This was an interesting project because also I was sort of spoiled by it, where I proposed this idea. They said, "Great, let's do it," and then I gave them a model and some schematic drawings, and then a couple of weeks later, it was done. So I was actually inhabiting my model, which was pretty impressive. That I've never experienced that in the past. But it also taught me a lot and gave me some bravery that it doesn't have to be that complicated. You just have to be convincing and sort of understand how things work. And then while I was in school, I was continuing to design things. I was really interested in not just purely coming up with ideas and drawings, but I actually wanted to see them and physically touch them. So this was a table that I designed that still works. It's a table based on kind of a simple idea. It's based on my pet bird. It's kind of funny, but that's where it started. But I wanted to kind of have this one continuous line that was folded to become a table, and I wanted to hang off the wall and sort of become the sculptural element in space. And then I also designed a necklace for my girlfriend, but now my wife, and just wanted to obviously impress her. But I was actually curious, how can you take a material that can transform itself from a round or a curvilinear line into something that's more flat, and something that could go from one shape to another. So in plan, you can see how it goes from a curve to a single line, and then in section, you can see the same thing, where it goes from a tube to a more of a flat surface. And when the two come together, there's a moment of sort of echoing that, which is integrating a piece of amber. This was one of my favorite impulsive designs and executions that I did while literally I was on summer break at my parents' house. It was a handrail. My father and I were putting an addition to my house, so I was learning a lot of things, but this was something I saw at a flower store. And I saw a piece of birch, and I thought, oh, this could be a handrail. It's perfect size. You can touch it, and it's a surprise, and it can become, again, a sculpture forever. 20 plus years later, it's still hanging there, and it's great, especially if most of you have, if you've touched the birch tree, how silky and smooth that skin of the bark actually is. What I didn't really realize until now, kind of going back, is how much I was actually learning, because materials behave in different ways. Understanding how things are put together, understanding where to source things, how much time things take. Those things I took for granted back then because it was all new, it was all a learning experience. But now, becoming an architect and working, you have that knowledge. You've kind of gone through that rigor, and it was happening at that time without kind of realizing it. And to me, this is something that's invaluable. And then right after school, because I've studied abroad a couple times, one in Versailles for a year, and then also an exchange program in Munich, I was a student all the time. So I wanted to actually experience Europe and that world, kind of, as somebody who actually lives there. So we moved in 2002 to London to work, live, travel. And while living in London, I needed another creative outlet, and making things was one, just not as easy because the resources, not knowing where and how, but I found this outlet through documentation. And the documentation I did was I discovered and noticed something that is rather beautiful and something that I didn't really pay attention to when I was in Europe the first few times, and it's scaffolding. And London was littered with scaffolding, and littered in a good way. I saw something that I called temporary permanence because it was always there, but it was disappearing as some of these facades were being repaired. So scaffolding was used to repair the exterior of these buildings that, because they're all landmarked, essentially these buildings will never disappear, and they need upkeep. So the scaffolding will also never disappear. But they're rather beautiful structures, and there's different conditions because there's different scales of buildings, different facades. And they use color for fabric. They are different heights, different scale, different moments in time. And to me, I was seeing London through a slightly different lens, and I was sharing this with my friends who I would take out a stack of photographs. Nothing was digital then, and kind of bore them for 45 minutes of like, look how cool some of these things are. This is, to me, this is truly architecture where there's beauty there. There's minimal kind of materiality use, and it's very functional. But there's something rather surprising where the two juxtapositions occur of something solid and something more lightweight. In the back of all these buildings, there's different conditions because the backs of the facades, they use more of a common brick, but they also need repairs and they also need to be able to be accessed. So you see different type of scaffolding and the juxtaposition of more of the similar tones and colors. More moments of, the wrapping essentially is to prevent dust from coming out of the work area or debris from falling from different areas, but from the outside you're seeing it completely different conditions. In these few slides, this becomes more structure. There's bridges that are created, there's balconies that are created. Again, these are all scaffolding. This is all a certain type of assembly that ultimately becomes the structure and architecture. The slide on the left I really like because of the end condition that you see, kind of these floating, almost shelf-like elements that are suspended in space. And then you start seeing the peeling of the skin, which is the wrap of the green fabric. Again, these are all architectural terminologies that I use now in my work, but I sort of interpreted them when I was seeing these things. Different scales, and this is across River Thames. You see this building cloaked. Suddenly it transforms itself, and then on the right you see a different condition again along a pretty dominant street, which is King's Cross. This was probably one of the last projects that Oscar Niemeyer, he's a Brazilian architect, probably one of the greatest of the last century. So this was a pavilion that was done in Hyde Park, but they used scaffolding to erect this structure, which I found quite interesting because it's a brand new building or brand new temporary building, and then using temporary elements to actually build it. A detail that I find absolutely beautiful, of this joint of two things coming together and then being held by this condition. And I have 100 more of these images, and I could probably do a lecture on just this, but I wanted to share these because to me it's important to sort of not necessarily lay foundation, but to sort of explain that creativity doesn't necessarily have to be purely about making buildings or spaces. There's outlets that exist that if we just able to pay attention to things around us, be able to focus on them, observe, those things end up somehow influencing you and also becoming part of who you are and what you do. So in 2008, I established my own practice after working for a few years in Chicago. I worked for Perkins & Will, and then I worked for Crick & Sexton Architects. Crick & Sexton is a smaller office, but there were two partners, Mark Sexton and Ron Crick. They were essentially disciples of Mies van der Rohe, and Mies suddenly became sort of part of my life in the literal sense, where I was working in the Mies building. I was also living in the Mies building because my wife and I bought a condo in one of the high-rises, the 880 building. And then I was also working under the Miesian disciples of Mark Iran. So suddenly this new language that I really wasn't introduced to in school became part of my life, and I became sort of obsessed with it in the sense where, even though people think Mies is someone who is extremely technical and minimal, but he's also an artist in the way he saw things, and the perception of how buildings are perceived, or how they're looked at, how spaces are understood. It is not necessarily purely about how they are actually put together. It's an idea of being able to see more than what's apparent. And this idea, these visual kind of interests that I've had since school started to become part of most of our work now. And this was a project that I did, a renovation of my apartment, that attested to a lot of these ideas. So the two plans on the right, those are the floor plans of the unit that we bought. It was about 780 square feet. But these are spaces that are pretty compartmentalized if nobody renovated them. So they're subdivided in order to accommodate the life of whoever's inhabiting. But I wanted to actually see what happens if you opened everything up, and how do you start to divide them in a minimal way. And one of the things I wanted to try is understanding glass and reflectivity. And so I created this monolithic kind of flooring approach to space, where at nighttime the floor just starts to extend itself out of the unit because glass acts more as a reflector. And then I also want to figure out what happens, of how people view your space from the outside, because it's a high-rise, it's pretty dense. So these are some sketches and some little renderings that I did quickly for myself, and then the plan kind of explains the new organization. I had friends who I went to school with, and my father who helped me out with building out and renovating the apartment. These are a few details just to share kind of how materials could start sharing that the visual connectivity, where the exterior in the background is the mullions of the exterior wall, and then the partition starts to take on the same kind of articulation, but for different reasons. The thickness of the material could be broken into two parts, so it doesn't appear as visually heavy because it's wood, and wood needs more thickness in order for it to work. I use clear glass to kind of work with continuity, allowing the material to flow through, and the translucent glass to give you a little more privacy. I continued making things. I made the island in the space. I separated the two volumes so you can see the wall beyond, again, not allowing your eye to continue and seeing things past their initial point. Thickness is interesting to me, and how do you break the thickness down? So the 5-inch wall, which is a typical stud wall, if you layer it in different thicknesses, you can see that in the back here, where 2 layers of exterior material inlaid with another material starts to visually look thinner and smaller. I built vanities for our space, one because I wasn't even sure where you source things at that point when I was starting out, but I was also interested in kind of fabricating stuff. So this was a CNC made stand. But what's interesting about this project, it's not necessarily the fact that there's a lot of ideas that were tested, which was obviously important to me, but again, I learned a lot from this. And what I really learned from this is that you can't do everything yourself, and you kind of have to rely on trades and other people that are able to be part of your world of creativity and output. So learning, how to lay tile, how to do drywall, how to even paint properly, and understanding what type of paint and the type of brushes to use. A lot of this was learning and testing and sort of experimenting on myself, which now I'm trying not to experiment on my clients. Fast forward to 2013, after finishing that project and living in that apartment, we had 2 kids and we had to move out. But during the time we were selling that apartment, we had quite a few people go through, and some people actually hired us to do their projects, even though they didn't buy the apartment, because they really liked the space that we created. So that yielded a lot more work, and sort of started to build a portfolio of clientele base of what we do. And then in 2013, I received a call from a gentleman who, Crick and Sexton, who I used to work for, recommended us because the project was too small for them. So they said, why don't you talk to Vlad, and he can probably help you out. So we got a call, and this was also a very exciting call because suddenly I was able to get a project in 880 building, but now with a budget and a client. And this is a very different space, and it's a corner space. So you can see on the left, this is the unit. And what's interesting about the corner units in the 860, 880 buildings is that they're a little bit more awkward, where they're strange in how they're laid out. Like the kitchen is in the bottom. It's pretty dark. You have these sort of narrow corridors. You have these subdivided spaces, and something that you wouldn't necessarily think is Miesian. In reality, it's actually not Miesian. It was more developer-based outcome for a plan. So we wanted to see, can we sort of rethink this layout in a way that could be more appropriate for how Mies thought, or how the buildings possibly could be looked at, or the spaces. So we took the bedroom, the sleeping area, and we put it to this section. And the reason we did that is because the lake is actually towards this side. So we placed the living room, or the living space, opening up to the lakefront. And then the next thing that I wanted to sort of continue is this idea of visual perception, and what does that mean in the context of this project. So there's this term called phenomenal transparency that I wanted to explore. And the phenomenal transparency as a term is basically things that visually connect or continue. They don't physically act that way. Like you're seeing things as they move through space, through objects, but they physically don't do that. So some of these diagrams start to show that, where we wanted this edge of the space to feel like it's one, and we wanted this edge of the space to feel like it's one. And then start reinforcing those with cabinetry. You can see this as a one gesture. These are folding. These shelves start to continue across the spaces. We put diagrams together. We built models. This is, I would say, a study model, but it was more of a finished model to not just study the ideas, but also be able to convey them to the client. Because you can talk about things and you can describe them, but until you're actually able to communicate that in a way that somebody fully understands, it's hard to convince them to actually buy into your logic, your ideas. So models are a big tool in the way we practice and the way we work, because models are something that we can both see and understand together. Construction is a big part of my life. I absolutely love being an architect for that purpose, to be able to visit job sites and seeing the past where things are taken out, and then seeing how things are assembled. So this is the space above that what we saw first time, and then below is it being sort of disassembled, and you can see the footprint or the plan of the walls imprinted on the ceiling. A few images of construction, how things are assembled, just kind of the beauty of the organization, the clarity of how things come together. The slide on the right shows a tile setter who suggested, and this is purely his suggestion because he saw the design we were after. Well, he said, you can remove the thickness of material by mitering the corners of it and be able to put it together in such a way that it feels more monolithic. You don't see the edges. Ever since, we've been using that strategy pretty much for all of our tile and anything that we fold when it comes to a solid surface. So we learn, again, every project is a learning experience to improve yourself, but also improve how you design. These are a few images of the finished product. This is looking at the entry now of that space. Here's that the space that you saw in the model. And this is the visual perception that I was describing, where you can see the wood wall sort of stitching through that space, but it stops where that white wall is. In the background, you can see that millwork piece that I was describing, or that cabinet, that it sort of punctures through the column, but it feels like it's one. And one of the reasons to do that is also to unify that space, because the column sort of creates an edge, creates a stopping point. By cutting through it and integrating into a space, it feels more unified and cohesive. Here's that view again of you seeing that wall cutting through the space into the kitchen. You start seeing these shelves wrapping themselves around the corner, and you'll see that in the next slide. We also did some interesting things with that wall, where the wall actually transforms and it hides the closets behind in a way that the doors actually starts to have dual function, where it closes the bathroom off from, for privacy purposes. No, the spaces are pretty dark, and light is a kind of a common thread and something that's really important in our practice and how we think and approach spaces. So this was not that much different, but what we tried in here is, in order to get light deeper into the space where the kitchen is, where I initially said it was pretty dark and disconnected, we actually used the shower as this device to get light into that kitchen and be able to connect back through the bathroom towards the lake. So we created this electrochromatic glass as this privacy glass that could turn opaque or clear based on the use of that room, but it still allows light through. But this is obviously a surprise, trying to convince somebody, hey, you can have a bathroom that is completely open, but it worked. And client is a big factor in successful projects. So he bought into the idea, and obviously it functions, and it still functions to the day. Some more images of the interior. Those are the shelves that are hovering, and you saw the construction of them, these stainless steel bent plates that are coming out of the wall. The bed, we designed all the millwork. We try to thin out our walls even further. You can see how thin the actual partition is. It's a 1/2-inch glass. We used a gradient, sandblasted finish on the glass where the privacy occurs at the bottom, and then it's more transparent above. So when you're standing, you're able to see and perceive the entire space. Also, beauty of glass, its reflectivity, be able to start to mix these reflections and viewing and kind of this interesting space. At the same time, we got this project, which is an interesting kind of relationship that I've had with a client, where when we began our office, I wanted to work with him because he was probably one of the few that was doing contemporary residential projects in Chicago. And at the time, it was 2008, and as most of you know, that's when the economy sort of was collapsing, and those are Great Recession. So nobody was building, and he wasn't going to give us a project at that time. But we stayed on his radar through the recession. And then 2013, he called and asked if we would be willing to work on his office. So this was he owned this entire complex, basically a building, and there's another building adjacent to it, and there's another building here which he rents. But there was this black box essentially on the outside that he was running an office out of. So you can see they're still working during the demo phase, but it was just a super kind of enclosed bunker with these, I don't know what the spaces were used originally, but there was just these leftover rooms that they weren't really using for anything. There was this garage dividing these two spaces that he wanted to take advantage of to expand his office. So we thought of this project in a way of sort of editorial approach and not additive, where we start to remove things. So thinking about just taking stuff out and kind of bringing it to the raw quality of what the space could be. We cleaned it all up, and then we introduced this, what we call the binding wall, this thing that looks like the snaking black line in plan, but in 3D and kind of this axonometric view, you see it more as a sculpted, meandering divider that basically integrates program into it and starts to divide spaces but also connect them. And that was really important because you have these different zones, but how do you make them feel more as one and kind of this one cohesive organization? So from a program standpoint, we gave this space as this use in one operation, and then we gave this space more of a kind of a privacy for his office and also a conference table. At the same time, again, the ideas of visual perception and seeing things and how do you work with materials. Moire is also an interesting kind of concept where you take two materials that have similar patterns, and by overlapping them, you create this beautiful sort of pattern, and this pattern is pretty dynamic. So if you see fences on the roads where there's patterns that are overlaid, they're sort of moving with you. So we tried that idea in this project, and those things became screens and also supporting elements for the desks. So in these 4 slides, you kind of see the sequence of construction where that old space was cleaned up, we cleaned the brick up, we opened up the walls, we brought back the joists to life, and then we started to assemble all of the new elements. So the new elements, they were built thinking of them a little bit more raw as well. So there's a nice kind of complement to the existing, but also creating enough juxtaposition where the two are working against each other. And here is the space assembled. So these are these massive screens in length. They're about 10 feet long by about 6 foot tall. The idea was that when you're standing up, you still feel like you're enclosed. But this pattern that's created is literally just 2 layers of half-inch perforated openings. And the interesting thing about it is, you're basically removing about 60% of the material weight. And through removal, the material gets lighter, but it doesn't lose its strength. And by taking the 2 materials and overlapping them, suddenly they become this beautiful outcome. And the desks we designed, and we built them out of MDF plywood, so they were integrated into it. So they needed each other in order to support. And you can see how thin the structure actually is relative to the thickness of the desk. This view here is what you see when you walk right into this office. He collects cars, so the cars became sort of on display as part of the experience of that place. Another detailed view of seeing this layering that occurs with the materials and overlapping. This is that binding wall that I was describing. You can see these ideas of phenomenal transparency being sort of carried through the projects of things cutting through and reappearing on the side. Another interesting moment here is this desk. From certain vantage points, this desk appears like it's sliding through the space, but in reality, it's not. But the way it's articulated, it's trying to suggest that, again, bringing spaces together so they don't feel so subdivided. This is his actual office, and we introduced this aperture here that sort of was this window that, again, allows you to connect to the space beyond. And it's something that sort of becoming a common thread in a lot of work. Orientation in terms of apertures and light, trying to achieve at least 3 or 4 orientations in each space, which is pretty challenging, but also becomes sort of a way to think, like how do you do that? So in this case, you get 4 apertures or 4 orientations within the room. This is the last slide of this project where it shows what the exterior now looks like. We also did some landscaping, but the openings are much bigger, and you're seeing the activity inside. At about the same time that we finished that project, and maybe a year on or less than a year, we were asked to do an office for 2 attorneys in the Fulton Market. And this is an interesting project because it had the similar questions of the previous one of what do you do with this raw space? How do you deal with this kind of time capsule? And it was a much bigger space. It was about 4,000 square feet, where the other one was 1,000 square feet. So the initial images that I'm showing you here is what we saw when we walked in. And the impressions were, well, you have this beautiful space on the top floor. You have these beautiful views, and then you have this massive footprint. How do you get light deeper into the space? How do you see out? How do you make sure that people working there don't feel like they're secondary citizens to the people that actually occupy the perimeter? So those are the questions that we initially thought. And then, if you can see here, the approach was, ductwork just sort of hangs in space, lighting sort of hangs in space. You sort of forget that you're in this beautiful loft building that, has been there for over 100 years. So, start asking these questions, how do you get light deeper into the space? How do people start to connect to the outside, and how do they feel like they're part of the whole versus being just, workers? And then how do you really highlight the beauty of the loft? And those were the 3 questions that we're trying to answer through, a simple kind of diagram of organization. And we came up with a strategy of taking these walls and sort of starting to weave them through the existing structure. And that became the direction for the project. And the walls, as you can see the slide with the shadows, that's something we really wanted to achieve, is these large apertures are able to bring light through those apertures deeper into the space and create these really unique shadows on the interior. So this is the plan, and an axon again to explain how we essentially organize the space. But one thing I wanted to highlight here is the perimeter. The perimeter we try to keep open and free as much as possible. And the reason for that is, again, so you don't feel like you have these compartmentalized individual spaces, but no matter where you are in the space, you're able to see the continuity of the existing walls. So we located the two partner offices at this side here, and then we created this lounge space in between where they can connect, but also people are able to come directly into it. And we recycled some of the existing windows from the original layout, and we reused them to enclose some of these other spaces in order to kind of keep that visual continuity. A few images of construction where you're seeing the existing space sort of transform. We painted the ceilings white, and we introduced a different lighting strategy of these sort of linear fixtures that were part of the existing grain that is the ceiling. And then by painting the ceilings, we really started to highlight the actual structure, the structure that is quite beautiful and aged well. We also lightened the floor a little bit. We used maple floor instead of what was there, again, to make everything lighter, to brighten the spaces. You can see this window. This is the reused window that we reclaimed from the original building. Here's a few end results where you walk into the space and suddenly these walls really feel like they're weaving in and out and kind of guiding you through the rooms. The apertures are quite big. They vary in size, but they're about 6 to 7 feet in width. And we use columns to actually divide some of these apertures. So, that opening here is, I would say, about 6 feet. So by keeping the column or adjusting the opening where it needed to, it sort of divided that entry point into two. Again, columns became dividers, but they also became connectors. This was an interesting kind of moment where the column actually is on the interior of this space, but then above it actually punctures out. So again, kind of stitching those spaces vertically. Images and views, again, the connectivity and kind of this continuity of the base becoming the frame for the apertures and then coming down and then going across keeps this common thread in the line, keeping the organization sort of together as a whole. This is that lounge that I was describing, where the column sort of bifurcates the space in half. Another interesting moment in the project, that middle zone that I was describing earlier as sort of the dark space, we placed the kitchenette on the backside, and this is where some of the paralegals are and some of the admins, so they're faced towards the outside, so they're able to see through these large apertures or these large openings towards the outside, so they're able to see through spaces. But then we introduced this workhorse, this volume, as a divider, as a screen, as a backdrop. And because it's such a big object, the fear was that this is going to look like something massive in the space. So what we came up with is this idea of, what if we, sort of suggest that it's actually suspended from the ceiling with these cables. In reality, those cables are actually just guide wires for the plants to grow. Again, we wanted to introduce some life and something that's constantly changing in the space where, this screen gets fuller as time goes on. But again, it visually gives you this lightness by literally just elevating this thing on something that, that's sort of pushed back and suggesting something else. These are the offices, the partners' offices. We hung their desks from the top, again, to kind of continue with the stuff that's already happening on the ceiling, instead of placing your typical feet or legs for the elements. This is those windows that I was describing earlier where you can see through the series of openings, which is the strategy on the perimeter. This is the other partner's office. His was a little bit lighter than the other partner. So these large glass enclosures were also utilized as writing board, so they can actually take notes and kind of activate the space and make it a little bit more dynamic. Shadows were a huge factor in considering this project from day one. So this was a fixture by Tom Dixon, which I really like, just the simplicity of it. But we hung it in a space that the wall now became this canvas to absorb the shadows. So you have this bulb that essentially emitting this pattern on the surface. These are just a few moments that I was describing of the ivy growing, this double layer of wire, these beautiful shadows that are cast on these white walls. So the walls are just absorbing this exterior as the light and the sun moves through, and then some writing on the glass. this again, just to kind of highlight and explain how interesting that is, because you have a white surface behind it, suddenly you have depth that's occurring. And for the last project, I'll show you probably our biggest project to date in terms of its size. And this is the project that we did that was completed a few years ago with the developer that we did the office for. And this is a multifamily building. We called it 2016 Rice project. It's in Ukrainian Village, and it was a first for us, and it was kind of nerve-wracking because we've never done a building before. We've done a house, which is quite different than designing for multiples and designing for a developer for profit. And we had this lot that was as a corner lot right on the alley, and they wanted to fit 8 units in there. And so this is lakefront, that's Chicago Avenue. This is where the site is. You can see it in context. So you have these small, low-profile buildings around it. We did a lot of studies, so these are kind of the finished iteration or the finished organization. But we came up with this idea of what if these could be individual kind of units that are sort of configured in a way that that makes this building feel as a whole, but then each person gets their own dwelling in the sense that it could feel like theirs. It's unlike living in the building that has multiple apartments. And we came up with a strategy of this puzzle kind of organization because we wanted to have duplexes, or they wanted to have duplexes and simplexes as part of the strategy. So you can see this puzzle, Tetris-like approach of these individual units that are similar at different levels, but they're just rotated and flipped. So that was fun for mechanical strategy and also structural strategy. And the way the building works is that you have 2 entry points, one here and one here. And that would allow people to come for different points into their units without necessarily needing to go through the central kind of entry all the time. So there's some individuality and separation that occurs, yet there's some commonality as well. And in the back, we carved out these outdoor spaces that essentially connect the units at the lower level. We also sloped the front a little bit in order to get more light to some of these, which you rarely see. Typically, a developer project, you try to minimize the amount of openings, but in order for these to be more desirable, we wanted to activate them with light. So these are some floor plans to kind of show you how the units work. So this is one unit here. This is another unit. So this box here actually overlaps the space here. So they're individually shown, but they're stacking. And then these here are the top units that essentially are identical. They're just rotated and flipped. There's 4 of those, and then there's 2 of these, and there's 2 of these. And then once we figured out this diagram, this part T, what was interesting is that the client just didn't understand how the building worked. Like, he just couldn't figure out how this thing is going to actually work. Like, where are the stairs? How do you get in and out? And I had the same problem with trying to convey that to the city, because they just couldn't get it. They couldn't understand that you can have 2 egresses, 2 means of getting out, 2 means of coming in at any given point. And that was a challenge. I had to sit down with a building commissioner and basically walk him through the project. And he understood, and we essentially worked together to get this thing permitted, because it was going to be a nightmare because it was somewhat atypical. And then we studied the exterior, and the exterior sort of came out of 2 directions. One, how do you thin out the wall? How do you make the wall thin, because it's a masonry building? That's what they wanted, and also because of the fire ratings and the size. The other thing I really was interested in, how do you make this thing dynamic again? As you have seen or heard, static is rarely used in my vocabulary, so dynamic, like how does that work? And we thought that the metal exterior facade could do that for us. Why? Because metal has reflectivity. It can change, throughout the time, morning, afternoon, evening, seasons. But also you have this, this undulation that, kind of gives depth when the light hits it. So, we looked at different colors, different finishes. It's long-lasting, but it's also super thin. So from a developer standpoint, by putting a super thin material outside of the building and cloaking it, you're essentially giving them so much square footage. So that was a good selling point. I took it from 2 directions. I can, you get more building, and I get my dynamic facade. So windows. That worked. We showed some renderings, kind of, we showed the fall season, like how this thing could start to look this way, and the evening house could start to look this way, and it worked. These were ways to explain how the building, could function. The windows were really interesting, how they were configured. So once we planned the building, we started to put holes where we wanted those holes to occur. So it wasn't sort of random, but start to think about it. If you have a corridor and you have a space you're walking through, what do you see beyond that point? And then through that strategy, we start thinking, okay, can some windows start to suggest what's actually programmed behind? So the larger square windows became more living spaces because they're more public and you don't necessarily need to open them and have operability, where the other windows actually became all operables. So that became this organization for the exterior. And then we grouped them, organized them so it feels more cohesive. Some construction images, the site actually, once it took down 3 buildings, it was massive, and it was a huge surprise. This emptiness that occurred once the buildings were extracted. And some masonry conditions, as the building was growing out of the ground, there was a lot of steel in the building to make that configuration work. And then they had some drone shots to show what this thing looks like. It was quite beautiful just to see this masonry box take shape. A few construction images. I absolutely love this. Some guys just came up with a handrail detail, and I definitely going to employ that one day into probably some project. But I just love that surprise. Tubes just held together by some welds. That's the scale of our windows. This is Fanny Hotan, who works with me. We went to the job site, having fun. And here's the outcome of the project. You can see the renderings and the models sort of become real. You can see the material again and how it's all organized, the windows, and how it starts to become this new neighboring context. You can see how the light changes its exterior. The corner is actually quite interesting. We have these large spaces that are dedicated for outdoor space that became this sort of communal dialogue between neighbors. But we also sort of thought that, why can't the front be the back being the front? These fire stairs now become elements that you see and you visually engage with. More details of entries. That's the back of the building, which to me is also front. It doesn't really have a front, so back has a logic. You can see how the skin changes. This is morning view. You can see the sunrise and sort of reflecting on the exterior of the building. The views of all these outdoor spaces, the balcony at the top, the terrace, and then those wells below. So now, people are still able to sort of visually connect and communicate. A few views of individual units. We used open grading for the stairs. I wanted to create sort of a sense of suspension if you're coming down. I thought it would be kind of interesting, but also you don't have this darkness above your head. You get light coming through. Some interior spaces, common corridors. They're pretty raw in terms of their materiality, but it's also a multifamily building that is going to be able to take the views. These are the views from the interior of one of the units. So you can see these large openings kind of framing the exterior. And these are 2 images of the lower units in the duplexes. Thank you very much.